This is Talk. Entry team, suspects have taken refuge in the area and are refusing to cooperate. Move in.
Okay, so do we want to... What direction do we want to flow? Do we want to flow right again?
Yeah.
And then I'll hold left.
Okay.
3, 2, 1.
Contact front! Check! Whoa. Ready or Not is fantastic. After 5 years of troubled development and some behind-the-scenes publisher drama, Ready or Not released in early access in December of 2021 to overwhelmingly positive reviews. Although it's still got a long ways to go, I'm confident in saying that it's shaping up to be one of the best tactical shooters on the market. What matters is that the developers, Void Interactive, are on the right track. Then what's the title about? Well, the game and its spiritual predecessor SWAT 4 have amassed a good deal of controversy, because their subject matter is, frankly, a controversial and polarizing subject: the police. Not your everyday patrol officers either, but its most militarized members, SWAT teams. Therefore, the central conceit of these games necessitates, on a base level, engaging with the fantasy of ethical policing. That is, a morally uncomplicated portrayal of police officers, utilizing their capacity to perform state-sanctioned violence when and where it is needed the most. However, that's not the end of the story. These games actually have a lot of interesting things to say about militarized police and their fundamentally American roots. That's why dozens of clickbait articles about these games being Copaganda annoy me. No doubt that before its proper release, there'll be 100 more misinformed takes about how Ready or Not glorifies the police, or is being edgy for the sake of shock value. It doesn't. In fact, it does the opposite. If you don't want to sit through a whole video, here's the TLDW in handy meme format. However, unpacking the hows and whys of that in a constructive fashion is a more laborious process than making a simple meme, or typing up a 500-word clickbait article and calling it a day. But Ready or Not and its predecessor deserve a deeper analysis. Hi, I'm Gunmetal Stug. I'm more well known for long-form, high-effort shitposts, but I'm tamping down on the funny tank man shtick this time around because the subject matter is far more grim. SWAT 4 and Ready or Not are both meditations on serious topics that have broken countless lives in the real world. This will serve as a content warning for both the games and real-life police violence. I'll also say that this video is inherently about America and American policing, so keep that in mind going forward. This video will also function as a companion piece to Face Full of Eyes, The Aesthetics of SWAT 4, which is a meticulous and enlightening breakdown of that particular game's storytelling. Now, in the Skyrim video, I discussed how every pillar of game design supports its ultimate purpose. While Bethesda games are corporate clown cars of muddled themes and mediocre gameplay focused on selling $60 dopamine treadmills, SWAT 4 and Ready or Not are strongly, violently purposeful. They are made with intent and a clear vision. Even in its early stages, it's obvious that Ready or Not mirrors its predecessor. These are games about American rot. About law enforcement doing its job in the last years of a fundamentally broken society, ripped apart at the seams by oligarchs and Christo-fascists and technocrats with the goal of extracting as much wealth from its people as possible. Ready or Not is about wading through what's left. In order to examine what this looks like and how it tackles these issues, we're going to do a deep read of the game, as well as examining what I mean by the fantasy of ethical policing. Then, I'll have some advice for Void about how they can move forward as they complete their narrative and approach 1.0. It should be noted that what follows is my own personal reading of Ready or Not and SWAT 4, not anything stated by the developers nor their ultimate intentions. Let's get started. Both SWAT 4 and Ready or Not are SWAT-oriented tactical shooters that examine the police in a time of advanced societal decay. Everything about them is built to serve this purpose, and the rich fidelity of this experience begins at a fundamental level, with its mechanics, or how the player interacts with the game. After all, a game's mechanics begets its story, begets its purpose. This is the core of ludonarrative harmony, and why SWAT 4 is one of my favorite games of all time. The reason why it's so good, and why it's getting a spiritual successor almost 20 years later, is because it understands how gameplay can influence narrative. Although the game has a competent tutorial, the most important lesson is taught to you in your first mission, when you treat it like any other shooter and immediately get gunned down by a takeout line cook with a rusty 9mm. Game over, restart. This teaches you two things, which sit at the core of why SWAT 4 still resonates. Guns are fucking dangerous, and people are unpredictable. Knowing that death could be around every corner and behind every door, you have to play intelligently and tactically. You have to constantly make judgment calls and cover angles. Further complicating matters are the unarmed suspects, civilians, and hostages in each level. Their presence means that you are constantly having to evaluate your targets and make split-second decisions on whether or not to pull the trigger. If you think you can skate by pepperballing everyone and sorting them out later, suspects with gas masks will make mincemeat out of you. Ready or Not has a virtually identical premise and mechanics, with some notable departures we'll discuss later. For now, I want to stress how good its gunplay is. The game already has a pretty wide variety of weapons, and each of them are sharp and responsive. What makes them work for a game about SWAT teams is that the guns being effective tools that are easy to use doesn't necessarily make them the optimal solution for every encounter. Taking clean, precise shots is easy when you're afforded the time and space to do so, but this is a rarity. More often, gunfights are deafening clusterfucks with bullets flying everywhere. Its suppression mechanic enhances this, ratcheting up the tension of each trigger pull without being completely overbearing. Although there's a discussion to be had about the realism of a suppression filter, I don't want to have it here. It makes shootouts terrifying and unpredictable, punishing you for playing sloppily while rewarding you for playing precisely. Good shit. Furthermore, these gunplay enhancements aren't just a side effect of a more advanced engine and a decade of progress in the medium, they serve a narrative purpose. See, beyond just the potential threat posed by every NPC in a given level, there's also the viability of, and damn near necessary, less than lethal equipment options. You're given a broad range of such tools because you're playing as a law enforcement officer, not a soldier. This fundamental element recontextualizes all of the danger present in these levels. Nominally, you're here to save people, arrest the baddies. In fact, doing so is the only way to beat levels. While it's common to joke that these games depict a fantasy version of the police where unauthorized use of force is actually penalized, this system is in place because it reinforces that these games are not about mindless killing. That's why these are two of the best tactical shooters ever made. Being the leader of a highly trained SWAT team carries entirely different connotations and expectations from your average generic soldier man protagonist. You aren't being flown to the other side of the globe to mow down hordes of faceless brown stereotypes in the name of freedom, burgers, and Dick Cheney stock profile. Ready or Not and SWAT 4 force you to think about every door, every encounter. This is what their grading systems reinforce, asking players to consider the deeper implications behind the numbers ticking up at the end of each level. However, whether as a byproduct of its earlier stage of development or a judicious commentary on the current state of American police militarism, Ready or Not is a far more lethal experience than SWAT 4. You die faster, you inflict death more often. You have to, because the police of today are not the police of 2006. While SWAT 4 was a game about decay and sadness, Ready or Not is about its explosive terminus, the utter unravelment of a society, a culture infested with nihilistic death worship, and self-feeding cycles of poverty and murder. Again, this is why mechanics are so fucking important. While Ready or Not's less than lethal options are still under development, I think that their current status as a challenge mode is an accurate reflection of how American police operate. Unless the mass shooter is white. Sorry, we'll get to that later. For now, remember that less than lethal gameplay is a core pillar of the experience, and that performing it perfectly is scored as the ideal level performance. Let's talk about those levels then.
Perhaps even more so than its intelligent game design and tactical shooter sensibilities, SWAT 4 is known for its environmental storytelling. How expertly the levels convey the stories within without bashing you over the head with preachy dialogue or ham-fisted video game writing tropes. Each level in the game is a carefully curated slice of awful, a brief glimpse into broken lives and a broken nation. SWAT 4's levels are grimy, gross, and uniformly dim, emphasizing its themes of rot and decay. Ready or Not does not lack for these elements, and has similar goals with its environment design, yet pursues them differently, explosively. It's absolutely critical to understanding the way it depicts the police, and therefore the overall narrative. Instead of a pointless, slavish devotion to pure realism, Void Interactive made a more inspired choice. Hyperrealism. They didn't make the levels look better than their predecessor just because that's what's expected of a more modern title. The colors are saturated, the shadows are sharp, blood and detritus are everywhere. The use of lighting can have a tremendous effect on how a level feels, as well as more effectively deliver a particular story, while also underlining the necessity of tools like night vision goggles and flashlights. There's a reason the darkest, most disturbing level is drenched in golden California sunshine. It's not reality. It's bigger, broader, more violent. more real than real. These levels and how they look are used to color the game's narrative in piecemeal, one small detail at a time. This is, again, on purpose, granting the game a more nuanced and subversive texture to its surface-level storytelling. I want to walk you through a couple of these levels to help illustrate my point. The club level is where the new lighting system really shines. Flashing lights, neon sex, and a glittering disco ball cast their light onto piles of corpses and rivers of blood. The contrast is deliberate and shocking and demands your attention. The victims' phones are still ringing, loved ones trying to reach them after seeing the news. Some are still alive. All of this is directly inspired by real accounts from the first responders to the Pulse nightclub shooting. But there are scenes here too that tell their own story. The people who were packed together on the dance floor are now a bunker of dead bodies. Auto-locking doors prevented many from escaping, the hallway repurposed into an execution chamber. But not every level is so gruesome. Others tell less violent stories. Twisted Nerve is a collection of dilapidated, low-income housing turned into a flophouse fortress and manufacturing lab. The building's crumbling interiors are built into their foundations. Sheet materials from the lowest-cost builder could not withstand the abuse from its negligent residents. A child convulses in her bedroom, a needle beside her. Desperation has driven derelict souls here and left them to rot. They're lost, scrabbling at dirt. In a more glamorous setting, disaffected and disenfranchised veterans have resorted to terrorism in an attempt to be heard. Their military background is evident everywhere. The group uses kitted-out assault rifles. Many are lacking legs. They give professional call-outs to each other and make use of long sightlines to maximize their advantages. You're never explicitly told who these people are and why they did what they did. The level speaks for itself. These men have been used up and left behind by the military-industrial complex, and it's your job to give their story its final, inevitable conclusion. In a similar vein, there is only one end for the most monstrous person in the game, Amos Vole. There's a lot to be said about what is easily one of the most sickening levels in a video game, but what makes it such a strong vehicle for environmental storytelling is that it doesn't start at Mach 11. You're given time to stew in the wrongness. You know from the briefing that you're busting a CP ringleader, and with the seeds of uneasiness planted, they're given time to take root. The living areas of his mansion are tacky and gross, but not overtly criminal. There's a more mundane family drama to uncover. There was a loving mother, a twisted father, a divorce. Janie, the daughter, is a normal, nice person. She's a tutor, she has fun with her friends, she cares deeply about the environment. She's selling the extravagant status symbol her father bought her and giving the money to charity, a brilliant touch showing how little Amos actually cared about her. The sense of wrongness is still there. As you progress through the mansion, it only increases. Burnt files, hard drives, and bathtubs. The gloss and cleanliness is so pristine it's overbearing. Then you find the basement. The rotten foundation beneath it all. It's inevitable that you'd find this here. The sheer scale of the evil, the wealth and power required to keep this horror factory churning up until the very last moment, the last second before Vole's final, twisted triumph. And then the end of the story becomes obvious. It's one of the most powerful and affecting levels ever put in a video game, and it was utterly necessary for the overall story of Ready or Not. Because what's great about every level released so far is that despite having radically different tones, themes, architectures, and suspects, they all feel uniquely American. They're connected. Each one paints a different portrait of different Americas, united in their brokenness. Each one is a stand-in for modern-day societal afflictions, the underbelly of the status quo that cannot hold. I could do whole videos on each one, but I don't want to spoil you. More important is the fact that when combined with the mechanics afforded to you, each hyper-real level taken together tells a more complete and compelling narrative than they do in solitude. As I mentioned in the introduction, however, these excellently constructed ludonarrative conceits don't stop SWAT 4 or Ready or Not from engaging in the fantasy of ethical policing. It's understated yet ever-present, and it is a uniquely subtle form of Copaganda. There are subversions built into how these games engage with it, but it's worth breaking down the specifics, because games this strong demand respect and serious analysis regarding their subject matter.
A quick reminder first. The fantasy of ethical policing is a vision of the police where unequivocal heroes are stopping objectively evil criminals from hurting innocent people. Both SWAT 4 and Ready or Not portray versions of this to some degree. Because in each game, the SWAT team are heroes. The armed suspects in both are cultists, separatists, terrorists, human traffickers, and organized criminals. They have undeniably perpetrated crimes that warrant the application of extreme state-sanctioned violence. These are quite literally some of the worst people imaginable. And you get to stop them. You break up their bases of power, arrest their lieutenants, gather evidence for their trials, and kill the ones that threaten the innocence or the lives of your fellow officers. Said fellow officers are also idealized versions of law enforcement officers. Your comrades aren't frothing white supremacists or up-jumped high school bullies with 3 months of training, a superiority complex, and a Punisher tattoo. They are professional elites. At all times, they are cool, collected, and shoot only when absolutely necessary. That is the ideal. But it is also a fantasy. Because these are video games, tactical shooters to be exact. It is functionally impossible to depict the realities of what police are and what they do within this scope. By repeatedly putting you in these situations of black and white morality with dire, immediate consequences, it is unintentionally implied that these are the realities of policing, that this is what police do, what they're like. This is the fundamental disconnect between their depiction in these games and reality. In the games, because they're tactical shooters, the high-risk warrants served by SWAT are accurate, necessary, and action-packed. In reality, missions like those found in Ready or Not, even the smaller ones, are once-in-a-career occurrences for most SWAT officers. If that. There are anywhere from between 50,000 to 80,000 SWAT deployments in the US each year, and 80% of those are just search warrants. Rarely do they end in a shootout even a fraction of the size of those depicted in Ready or Not. Oftentimes, these raids are completely unnecessary, wrongly deployed, or used in place of more traditional and less dangerous policing methods. In 2022, a SWAT team murdered a 15-year-old boy by accidentally setting him aflame with a flashbang, as they served a warrant for minor parole violations. When all you have is a jackboot, every problem starts to look like a neck. Although I am always an advocate for developers making games that can challenge players both mechanically and intellectually, asking players to actively participate in more common, realistic, and troubling policing practices is not something that would fly. At all. While some games have played with the idea of doing some truly awful, heinous shit, they only do so to bring up discussions around it, not to build their core gameplay loops around these topics. I don't doubt that there's writers and studios that could do this in interesting, productive ways, but I think that the nature of video games as an interactive medium would distort the message so thoroughly that it would be lost on the vast majority of players. It's not that I think audiences are incapable of parsing nuance, but rather that it would, regardless of intent, become a vehicle for fascists to live out their twisted fantasies. Some might argue Ready or Not and SWAT 4 already do this, but this isn't true. Not necessarily. It's possible to be a cruel edgelord, disregard the core premise, and execute everyone, but at that point you're not engaging with the content critically or honestly, like people who think Rage Against the Machine were good before they got political. Playing the game as intended is a far more constructive and engaging experience. Thinking about it for more than 5 minutes, you can start to pick apart how SWAT 4 and Ready or Not actually subvert the fantasy in interesting ways. The 3 I want to focus on are the following. 1. You do not truly save anyone. As mentioned by Eyes in his Aesthetics of SWAT 4 video, the evil festering behind these closed doors has been stewing for a long time, years even. Often, it has exploded. In this capacity, SWAT teams in both games are only really performing triage. You can get a few innocents out of fucked up situations, sure, but nothing you do prevents the suffering that's already happened from happening again. SWAT is palliative care, not restorative. You cannot affect systemic change. You cannot reverse the failed war on drugs. You can't end the opioid epidemic. You can't help people out of poverty to prevent crime from happening in the first place. Nor can you arrest the people who are truly responsible for all this fucked up shit in the first place. Ready or Not hits this home a little harder than SWAT 4 with its latest levels. The bodies have already piled up. Each of these high-risk warrants are the result of the society that produced them, and their tragedy was inevitable. Even those that survive are scarred for life, and your reward for a job well done is to do it again somewhere else. Again, and again, and again. Number 2. While the games do feel good to play, the actual shooting in both games is realistic and appropriately depicted. People scream in pain, dive for cover, panic. Killing someone drops them realistically, no cartoonish ragdolls or hurling people through walls. Overpenetration can often result in civilian casualties. The levels are littered with gruesome earmarks of violence, sometimes more obviously than others. Number 3. This violence is also discouraged. While it's much more important in SWAT 4 to attempt less than lethal solutions than it is in Ready or Not, some levels still automatically fail if you kill the wrong people. Even though you can still succeed after failing some objectives, those penalties invite you to examine their overall purpose as a mechanic. Think about it like this. How many tries did it take you to 100% a mission? Get an S rank? How many dead officers and hostages and accidental uses of lethal force? This is subtly teaching you, though perhaps too subtly for the average American, about how truly, deeply fucked these situations are. The chances of doing a mission perfectly the first time are virtually nil. These are dire, hopeless situations. 4. The aforementioned hyper-realistic art style. Because every level has this gross sheen to it, this skewed layer of over-the-top unbelievability, Ready or Not asks the player to distance it from reality, and therefore the realities of actual police work. It's not trying to convince you it's an authentic depiction, it's trying to impress upon you its overarching narrative goals without relying on stilted or patronizing exposition. Each of these points have their own flaws. In the first, the lack of debriefs, post-mission analysis, and narrative through-lines between missions de-emphasize SWAT's role as a state-sanctioned sledgehammer to problems that really shouldn't exist in the first place. In the second, SWAT 4 shooting is a little dated, and the ragdolls make really cartoonish flopping sounds. In the third, Ready or Not's non-lethal gameplay options are still under development, and more objectives focused on arresting suspects would help. Void has also promised a more detailed locational damage and gore system, which isn't fully in yet, but promises to greatly enhance the game by rendering its violence in more gruesome detail. It's a firm belief of mine that any sanitization of violence is a tacit endorsement of it. As for the fourth point, it could be argued that the heightened reality of the game is intended as a stylish endorsement of violent kinetic police work. I believe it's totally possible to come away with that impression too, if you don't take the time to connect the dots and consider the rest of the systems at play. However, considering these subversions as a whole, it's difficult for me to see these games as sinister propaganda. There's a lot of really engaging, important stuff they're saying and portraying that are often glossed over. The genre and the medium as a whole are improved by their existence. They only engage with the fantasy because to do otherwise would make for an unplayable game. Most actual police work is drudgery and tedium. In fact, it's so boring that the Supreme Court said that it's possible to reject applicants on the basis of them being too smart for the work. The Supreme Court also said that it is not required of the police to actually save anyone. The failure of the police to act at Uvalde is cited as anomalous behavior, but they technically, legally, didn't do anything wrong. I'm sorry, but we have to do this. If you've been confused as to my tone and the way I talk about good policing as a fantasy, we have to talk about it. About why Ready or Not's depiction of the police matters. Why I care so much about making the distinction between fantasy and reality. Because Ready or Not and SWAT 4 deserve it. The fantasy is a fantasy because even if a real-life SWAT team lives up to it, the officers are upstanding, professional, and used appropriately in situations of dire need, the ultimate system they support, the justice system, is fundamentally broken. Even the best cops who save lives, hate racists, and want a better, more functional justice system cannot pursue these goals while executing its current vision. The ones that try to improve things are ostracized, fired, or suffer crippling burnout and quit. Usually some combination thereof. Why? Well, there is no ethical policing because the entire justice system is built not to deliver justice nor enforce laws, but to protect the wealthy and powerful and inflict further misery on the poor. Like the electoral system, the economy, and the media, the Justice Department has been totally decoupled from any meaningful regulation or accountability, which has gutted the purpose those institutions have traditionally held when it comes to their roles in organizing and safeguarding society. Bit by bit, inch by inch, each of these institutions have fallen prey to regulatory capture. With their unparalleled ability to accrue, concentrate, and thereby direct the flow of wealth, corporations and the oligarchs that run them have fundamentally subverted every facet of a functional society. The only purpose these systems fulfill anymore is to further the acquisition of yet more capital. This isn't some crazy Marxist take from a frothing infantile tanky. This is reality.
Yes, we're still talking about the police. They are very much intertwined with broader institutional rot, sometimes by accident and sometimes by design.
Then what is the reality of the police? Again, they're essentially foot soldiers for the wealthy, serving as facilitators for the prison industrial complex, suppressors of labor movements, and the persecutors of marginalized communities. More broadly, in their pursuit of protecting oligarchs, they are the instrument of violence directed at all poor people, not just minorities. Laws are written by lobbyists to target the impoverished are persecuted, and then the impoverished are enslaved. This isn't a metaphor. The 13th Amendment allows enslavement as a punishment for felonious offenses, and I shouldn't have to tell you, but many crimes that are considered felonies are utterly insane. None are more infamous than the laws written to wage the war on drugs. To sum it up, here's a quote from one of Nixon's domestic staffers, John Ehrlichman. You want to know what this war on drugs was really all about? The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Nominally speaking, America champions liberty, morality, and individuality, speaking truth to power. In actuality, these hippies and blacks, as referred to by Mr. Ehrlichman, their reward for having the fundamentally American, foundationally human moral courage to oppose a pointless, unjust war was to have their lives and communities shattered. In 1985, the Philadelphia Police Department dropped 2 improvised explosive devices on the MOVE community, starting a raging inferno that the fire department deliberately chose not to extinguish. The flames destroyed 61 homes, displaced 250 people, and killed 11. 5 children burned to death. For more modern dark realities in the justice system, we can look no further than the Kids for Cash scandal, where a Pennsylvania judge sentenced up to 6,000 kids to juvenile prisons on up-jumped adjudications in return for a measly $3 million in kickbacks from a for-profit detention center. At every step of this process, the police facilitated these arrests and helped imprison innocent children. We could continue talking about smaller, more individual incidents of police brutality, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders, etc. However, the list is too extensive to enumerate fully, so I won't. Plus, there have been some really insightful books on the topic that go into far more depth than I can get into here. More on that at the end. The overall point I'm trying to make here is not that these atrocities are the everyday remit of everyday policemen. Rather, I want to point out that each of these incidents warranted a total national reform of how policing is performed, and the broader context with which they execute their mission, i.e. the justice system and American incarceration. Yet on every account, nothing was done to amend the underlying issues. The war on drugs made America the prison capital of the planet, with 1,215,800 persons incarcerated at the end of 2020. To put this into perspective, the US has 5% of the world's entire population, but 25% of the global prison population. Laws built to wage this war are still on the books across the country, explicitly written to disproportionately target African American and Hispanic communities. Private prisons were not abolished, challenged, or even seriously criticized. They just got bigger. Today, the prison industrial complex is collectively valued at $10.4 billion, and that's not counting the wealth created by enslaved labor. Police brutality was reinforced by a massive influx of white nationalist enrollment, as documented in an FBI memo in 2006. Nothing was done about it. The ones that stuck around became the establishment, spreading their poison from the top down. Officers adorn themselves with Nazi symbols and buy merch with the intent of extolling the virtues of extrajudicial murder. Whenever an officer is brought up on charges, the police unions close ranks, get the blue flu, and refuse to do their job until the justice system literally allows them to get away with murder. They claim the police are under attack, but COVID is one of the most prolific cop killers in the 21st century, yet their vaccination rate is horrible, and police unions constantly lobby against getting them. If the police actually thought that blue lives mattered, they'd get the fucking jab. This is policing. Even the best of the best, working as hard as they can with their lives at stake to protect the public, cannot repudiate these realities while working as a part of the system. The heroics of SWAT 4 and Ready or Not are the exception that proves the rule. However, this is why these games are so important. Because they provide a vehicle for these discussions. They invite the player to think about the police, about SWAT teams, about American rot. With all this in mind, I do have a few humble suggestions for Void Interactive, and how they can carry the legacy of SWAT 4 forwards. I like to have sections like these in my essays, not because I think I give qualified, or even quality advice, but rather that I enjoy the more critical, productive conversations they can inspire. Plus, early access was always stated by Void to be a time for community feedback, so here's mine. It'll be quick, I promise. First off, many others beside myself have noted that the environmental storytelling could use a few more passes, and Void themselves have acknowledged that this is something being saved for later stages in development, and I think that's fair. There's also been a lot of discussion regarding the 911 calls in SWAT 4, and how they added a hefty degree of context for the team's actions. This way, the high-risk warrants felt high risk, and more like actual warrants than no-knock military raids. I concur that bringing these back is important, but also realize that briefing sections are probably the last thing to do for the single-player campaign. They require more finalized voice acting, mission maps, narrative QA, etc. What I haven't seen too much discussion of is the potential for after-action debriefs. The scoring system already supports accounting for specific events that occur during missions, and I think it would be interesting to examine the story results of how a mission went down. Even if it's nothing more than a simple overall campaign score and ending slides like in a Fallout game, it would go a long way towards placing police actions, SWAT activity, and the greater sense of the justice system in a broader, more critical context. You don't have to spell out for the player, hey, maybe this is all just a little bit fucked up. But just by giving some more concrete conclusions to the events of the missions can help further illustrate the purpose of their design. As for the missions themselves, when you make the inevitable cult level, make them Christians. Anything else I think would be a little too cartoonish. It also missed the mark when the vast majority of these militarized cults are already some splinter of Christianity anyway. Please don't end up like Far Cry 5, where you dance so close to making a poignant commentary on American society and then swerve away at fucking light speed. The Children of Tyrone were better suited for SWAT 4 in the times in which it was released, but I think that the sharp uptick in Christian-flavored religious fascism in recent years calls for a more direct examination. Speaking of tone, I advise that you don't go further than the Valley of the Dolls. I think that level is appropriately, stomach-churningly horrifying, but it does get pretty close to the line of parody. That is, the vileness of it all is so extreme and the scale of it so immense that the tension of that level nearly collapses under its own weight. I promise I'm not out here like Jack Thompson trying to censor you or anything, just that tone is something that has to be carefully managed with a laser focus. Anything more gross in the Valley of the Dolls would become so extreme that it'd be difficult to take the rest of the game seriously. It's a bit like how Agony tried to make a really graphic version of Hell, but made it so insane and ridiculous that it was impossible to treat it as anything other than a theme park of unintentional hilarity. Going farther than the Valley of the Dolls would also come off as callous headline chasing. It would also demean the horrors depicted therein, turning a reflection of America's brokenness into a lurid parade of shallow shock value. You don't want pizza cutter edge. No one wants that. Therefore, I think Valley of the Dolls fits perfectly as a finale mission, and although I can't comment on how the campaign might be structured at this stage of early access, I think it'd be a fitting conclusion to the game's story. Nothing is going to be more repulsive on a storytelling front, and the mansion's open floor plan with its nested rooms full of elite private security types serve as a fitting finale on a mechanical level as well. And finally, although it may not align with the current plans for the narrative, I truly hope you include a mission examining the rampant institutional corruption and racism within the American police, as well as barriers to real progress like the Fraternal Order of Police. A narrative about the collapse of the American Empire is fundamentally incomplete without a commentary on the role of the police as protectors of moneyed interests and the outdated ideals they reinforce. So yeah, that was a pretty heavy video compared to my usual fare, but I felt it was necessary to make. I love SWAT 4 and Ready or Not, and I think they have important things to say. Void Interactive has a damn good game on their hands, and I'm excited to see where the early access period takes us. As America continues to grapple with its corrupted institutions and the systems that enforce their will, it's pieces of new media like Ready or Not that can help provoke meaningful, constructive conversations about these topics. That's why clickbait articles on the game frustrate me so much. There's a rich vein of storytelling and good game design to examine here, and seeing it reduced to Copaganda is frustrating to say the least. Speaking of which, if you found this stuff fascinating and you want to make yourself miserable by learning more, or you thought this entire time that I'm just a softy libtard cuck talking out of my ass, this video is far too short and far too focused to give you the full picture. If you want more detailed discussions on policing, I suggest the following, with links in the description. Skip Intro has a fantastic series called Copaganda, which examines how our media influences our perception of police. Sometimes it's by accident, and sometimes it's more sinister, but the way he breaks these shows down and corrects their misconceptions is exceptional. As previously mentioned, go watch Face Full of Eyes, The Aesthetics of SWAT 4. Good video, very well presented, good shit, go watch it. it's important for you to find a copy of Dr. Sheldon Wolin's Democracy Incorporated, Managed Democracy and the Specter of Inverted Totalitarianism. This book provides excellent context for what the fuck I was rambling about when I talked about regulatory capture, subverted institutions, and how it's impossible for police to ethically uphold these broken systems. For more direct discussions on the police, consider Michelle Alexander's landmark book, The New Jim Crow, which is a more scholarly analysis on how the criminal justice system has devastated black communities, and the role the police have played in executing broken policy. As a corollary, I suggest Marie Gottschalk's Caught, The Prison State and the Lockdown of American Politics, which tackles similar topics with a stronger focus on the prison industrial complex. Finally, I recommend Alex Vitale's The End of Policing, which made the media rounds a while back, but it's still a fantastic and important read. Although I don't concur with everything in the book, it's an important starting place to start thinking more critically about policing systems. Now, Void Interactive has a hit on their hands, and I'm happy for them. Even in its rough, unpolished state, Ready or Not is a fantastic game. It's also an important one. Not only does it have to live up to the legacy of SWAT 4, but as its successor, it has to forge its own identity and make itself distinct. It has to update its tones and themes to fit the modern political hellscape.
So, is Ready or Not Copaganda? Yes and no. When I said it's complicated, I hope I've impressed upon you what I meant by that. Personally, I don't think Void intends the game to be an uncritical endorsement of the police, but given the medium and genre their game operates within, they are, by fiat, engaging with the fantasy of ethical policing, ergo, Copaganda. Combined with Void's esoteric storytelling and how everyone reacts to art differently, particularly when presented with a less straightforward narrative, intentions can become obfuscated. Void made an unsafe, yet respectable choice. They asked the player to read in between the lines. Hope this video helped illuminate how they do so to those unconvinced, as well as the potential this game has once it hits 1.0. American policing and its increasing militarism is a complex subject, riven with decades of violence and death, so it's important for a game with these elements at its center to have an intelligent conversation about them. After all, we're living through turbulent, violent times. These days it's easy to feel helpless, powerless. Beyond SWAT 4 and Ready or Not's engaging game design, it's easy to see why they have enduring appeal, why they resonate so deeply. There's a reason the fantasies they portray are so alluring, and why it's so vital to discuss them critically. Because just for a little bit, even just 5 to 10 minutes, they make you feel like you can do something. You can be a hero. You can bring order to chaos.
Goddess said red, this is what she said.